Welcome back to Echoes of Ihsan, everybody. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that might surprise some of you.
Oh,
Yeah, military expeditions.
interesting.
And you know what's even more interesting? Our source material is Volume 3 of Sunan al Tirmidhi.
Now, when you think of that collection of hadith, you don't immediately think of, like a manual or a handbook for rules of war, right? But that's actually exactly what we're going to be uncovering today.
Yeah, it's like you're flipping through a cookbook expecting like recipes for lentil soup, and all of a sudden there's this chapter on sword fighting techniques, you know?
Right. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I'm super curious to see what we're going to uncover today.
Well, I think you'll be surprised. Because Sunan al Tirmidhi, it kind of presents this perspective on warfare that really challenges a lot of modern perceptions. It's not just about, tactics and strategy. It's really about cultivating a certain mindset, this kind of spiritual warrior ethos, you could say.
Okay, I'm all ears. But before we jump into all of that, maybe for those who are listening who aren't as familiar with Sunan al Tirmidhi, can you just give like a real quick overview of what this text is?
Sure. Imagine a collection of stories and teachings from the Prophet Muhammad's life, meticulously compiled by Imam Tirmidhi back in the 9th century. That's essentially what Sunan al-Tirmidhi is. And it's one of the 6 most important hadith collections in Sunni Islam, and it offers guidance on a whole wide range of topics, like everything from prayer and fasting to how to interact with your neighbor. And surprisingly, as we were talking about today, how to conduct yourself in war.
So these hadiths aren't just like abstract theological concepts. It's like real life, snapshots into how to actually live as a Muslim, right?
And that's what makes them so fascinating, especially when we're talking about military expeditions, because it gives us these glimpses into how the early Muslims, they navigated the complexities of conflict while always trying to align their actions with their faith.
Okay, so how does jihad fit into all of this? Because that word, I think, is often used, especially in the West, with a lot of misconceptions.
Yeah, it's definitely one of the most misunderstood concepts. And the thing is, it's not just about holy war. It's really a much, much richer and nuanced concept. A multifaceted idea, you could say, that includes both like the internal struggle against one's base desires. So, with constant striving for self-improvement.
Right.
But then it also includes the external effort to defend Islam and to establish justice when necessary.
So it's like an internal jihad and an external jihad.
Exactly. 2 sides of the same coin.
Okay.
And Sunan al Tirmidhi actually sheds light on both of these aspects,
Wow.
reminding us that even in the midst of, conflict and war, this inner struggle, the struggle for spiritual growth, that's still paramount.
So it's not just about mindlessly charging into battle. It's about having a clear understanding of why you're fighting and constantly checking your intentions.
It's a great observation. Yeah. The hadith emphasize that without the right intention, outward actions, they're basically meaningless.
Right.
In fact, Hadith 1590, it states that after the conquest of Mecca, there is no more hijrah.
So like the Prophet Muhammad migrating from Mecca to Medina.
Exactly. So that monumental event, it marked this turning point. And this hadith suggests that once Mecca, which is the holiest city in Islam, once that was secure, the focus kind of shifted.
Okay.
Shifted from migration to a different kind of struggle, jihad. And remember, that includes both the internal and the external.
So the emphasis shifts from seeking safety to actively like defending and upholding your faith, but with the right intentions.
You got it. It's about standing firm in your belief and striving for a higher purpose, even when you're facing adversity. And this idea is further emphasized in Hadith 1604, which discourages Muslims from choosing to live among idolaters simply for safety. So it's about maintaining that distinct Islamic identity, not compromising your values, even if you're facing hardship.
So it's that idea of choosing to stand apart, even if it means putting yourself at risk. It's a powerful message. So we're starting to see this theme of righteous conduct emerging even in the context of war. But I'm wondering, when it comes to the actual fighting, what kind of guidance does Sunan Tirmidhi offer on how those battles should be waged?
That's where it gets really fascinating. Because Volume 3 really dives into specifics, covering everything from strategic considerations to how to treat captives, even how to distribute spoils of war. For instance, Hadith 1551, it highlights this interesting point that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala actually made spoils of war lawful for Muslims. Now, this might seem like a kind of minor detail, but it actually sets the stage for a whole system of ethics and regulations surrounding warfare.
So it's not just about winning at all costs. There's this framework of rules and principles.
Exactly. And those rules were seen as this divine privilege, like a sign of God's favor that distinguished the Muslim Ummah from previous prophets who actually weren't allowed to take spoils of war. But there were conditions attached to it. So spoils could only be taken after a legitimate victory, and they had to be distributed fairly and justly according to specific Islamic guidelines.
So it wasn't about enriching yourself through conquest. It was about ensuring the spoils actually benefited the entire community.
Precisely. Communal benefit, not just personal gain.
Okay.
And this concept of ethical conduct, it extends to other aspects of warfare as well. So, for example, Hadith 1552, it offers this tactical advice, suggesting that Muslim armies, they should attack after the morning prayer and avoid the midday heat.
Wow, so specific. I wouldn't expect that level of detail in a text about warfare.
Right. It's almost like getting a peek into the Prophet Muhammad's military playbook.
Mm-hmm.
But beyond this kind of practical advice, it highlights this principle that even in the heat of battle, there's this focus on balance and strategy and the well-being of the soldiers. It's not just about reckless abandon.
Okay.
It's about calculated action.
So even amidst the chaos of war, there's a sense of order and discipline guided by these Islamic principles.
Absolutely. And that practicality extends to the tactics as well. So Hadith 1554, it permits the destruction of enemy fortifications and even the burning of trees if it's deemed necessary.
Burning trees, that sounds a bit harsh, doesn't it?
It does sound harsh out of context.
Yeah.
But you have to remember, we're talking about ancient warfare. And dense forests and these fortified structures, they could be used to ambush enemy forces.
Yeah, true.
And destroying those things could be a necessary tactic to ensure the safety and the victory of the Muslim army. But even then, it's not about just wanton destruction, right? It's about this calculated necessity, like a means to an end.
So minimizing risk and achieving the strategic objective, but still operating within Islamic principles.
Exactly. And those principles are really clearly outlined in other hadiths, like Hadith 1570, which explicitly prohibits the killing of women and children in war, which is really a powerful testament to the value of human life in Islam, even in the context of conflict.
Right? Even non-combatants.
Yeah.
So that's a pretty remarkable statement, I think,
That's
especially considering the historical context.
Yes.
So this ethical consideration wasn't limited to just conduct on the battlefield. Sunan al Tirmidhi also addresses the treatment of prisoners of war. Right.
You are absolutely right. And, the way a society treats their captives, I think it speaks volumes about their values. And the Islamic teachings on this topic, I think they're quite profound.
Okay.
So Hadith 1566, it says that whoever separates a mother and her child will be separated from his loved ones on the day of judgment.
Whoa, that's a very powerful image.
It is.
It really drives home the point about compassion, even for those captured in battle.
It does, doesn't it? It evokes this raw emotion of that situation, the trauma of families being torn apart.
Yeah.
And it serves as this really stark reminder of the human cost of war and this importance of treating even your enemies with dignity.
It's about rising above the desire for revenge and recognizing our shared humanity.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
at this theme of just treatment, it continues when we look at how Sunan al Tirmidhi addresses the distribution of spoils of war, especially with regard to captives. We already talked about how spoils, they were this divinely granted right.
Right.
But Hadith 1553 outlines specific guidelines for their distribution. So 15 of the spoils were allocated for communal purposes, like supporting the poor and maintaining mosques.
So it wasn't just about dividing up the loot among the warriors. It was about making sure the community as a whole actually benefited.
Precisely. And the remaining 45, those were divided amongst the warriors who participated in the battle. But even then, there was a system in place to ensure fairness and to prevent any disputes. What's particularly interesting, though, is that Hadith 1557 says that a non-Muslim fighting alongside the Muslims is entitled to a share of the spoils.
Really? Even if they haven't converted.
That's right. And this demonstrates this importance of honoring agreements and recognizing contributions regardless of religious affiliation. I think it points to this really inclusive nature and also the pragmatism of the early Muslim community, this willingness to acknowledge and to reward those who fought alongside them, even if they didn't share the same faith.
That's incredible. It really challenges that us versus them mentality that we often associate with war.
It does, doesn't it? It shows this more nuanced understanding of alliances and collaboration.
Yeah.
And that pragmatism extended to the option of ransoming captives,
Okay.
as mentioned in Hadith 1567.
Yeah.
And this allowed for a peaceful resolution to conflicts and the potential for reconciliation and healing.
So even amidst the brutality of war, there were avenues for peace and diplomacy.
Absolutely, and those avenues were often pursued. Hadith 1714, it recounts the Prophet Muhammad consulting with his companions about the captives from the Battle of Badr,
Right.
which is one of the most significant battles in early Islamic history. And it demonstrates this value of consultation and deliberation, even in matters of war and captivity.
It's almost like we're seeing the roots of some sort of proto-democratic system
Mm.
where the leader is actively seeking counsel
Right.
and considering different perspectives.
Yeah, it really speaks to that emphasis on shura, or consultation. Even though the Prophet Muhammad was a divinely guided leader, he still valued the opinions of his companions, and he actively sought their input in the decision-making processes. And this hadith shows that principle extending even to the battlefield. And this brings us to another, I think, crucial aspect that's highlighted in Sunan al Tirmidhi, and it's this balance between obedience to authority and adherence to Islamic principles.
That's interesting because obedience to authority it's a fundamental aspect of a lot of religions, including Islam. So how does Sunan al Tirmidhi reconcile that with the ethical considerations we've been discussing?
Well, Hadith 1707, it offers this crucial caveat to the principle of blind obedience.
Oh, okay.
It states that while obedience to rightful authority is generally required, it's not absolute.
So there are limits.
Yes, there's a very clear boundary, and that is that you're not obligated to obey orders that contradict Islamic teachings or moral principles.
So conscience and religious principles trump blind obedience, almost like an early form of civil disobedience.
It's a compelling parallel. And this tension between obedience and adhering to Islamic principles, it's really a recurring theme in these chapters on military expeditions. It suggests that even in the heat of battle, individuals, they are expected to exercise their moral judgment.
Wow, that's a lot to unpack. We're just scratching the surface here of the insights from Sunan al Tirmidhi on these military expeditions, and I'm already seeing a much more complex picture than I initially expected.
Me too. And before we, I guess, dive further into those complexities of warfare and the ethical considerations, I think it's worth maybe taking a step back
Okay.
and appreciating some of the really fascinating details that Sunan al Tirmidhi reveals about the Prophet Muhammad himself, his
Yeah.
personality, his leadership style.
Yes, let's lighten things up a bit with some of those quirky tidbits that you mentioned earlier.
Absolutely. I mean, it really humanizes the prophet, makes him more relatable, and plus sometimes these small details, they reveal these deeper insights
Right.
into the mindset and the values of that time.
So what kind of quirky details did we find?
Okay, so Hadith 1696, for example, describes the prophet's preferred horse markings.
Really?
Yeah.
Ah.
Apparently, he favored black horses with a white blaze on the face and white on the upper lip. And if the horse wasn't black, he liked a reddish-brown horse known as kumait with similar markings.
I cannot believe there are hadith about horse markings. That's amazing.
Right.
It's so specific.
It's this delightful little detail that really adds a touch of personality.
Yeah. To the prophet's image.
Right. And it also kind of shows that even amidst these weighty responsibilities of leadership, he still had an eye for detail, an appreciation for aesthetics, even in something as practical as a war horse.
Exactly. And speaking of surprising details, another one we found is the use of code words in battle. Mentioned in Hadith 1682, it says that if Muslim forces were surprised by an enemy attack, they should shout "Ham" to boost morale.
Wait, that's the code word. It sounds kind of comical. Is that really effective?
It might sound strange to us,
Yeah.
but remember, this is ancient warfare.
Yeah.
And in the context of a sudden attack, a simple code word like this could actually have a powerful psychological impact. Imagine this sudden unified shout. It could rally the troops, disrupt the enemy's advance, and create this sense of cohesion and purpose.
Like a verbal war cry. Exactly. And these details, as seemingly trivial as they are, they offer these insights into the strategic thinking, even the psychological warfare tactics. They remind us that warfare, which we often think of as just this purely physical thing, the mental and psychological aspects, they play a crucial role as well.
They also make the history come alive. You can almost imagine these scenes unfolding, hearing the clash of swords, those shouts of "Ham" echoing across the battlefield.
It's a good reminder that history is made up of real people with personalities and quirks, moments of brilliance and even humor. And these seemingly insignificant details, they often reveal more than we realize.
Right. They add color and texture to it, what could otherwise be a very dry recitation of facts.
Yeah.
And it's these little details, I think, that help us connect to the past, help us understand the human stories.
Absolutely. And speaking of details, there's another intriguing one about the Prophet's attire.
Oh,
Hadith 1768 mentions him wearing a Roman jubba with tight sleeves.
a Roman juba. So he was adopting elements of Roman fashion.
It appears so. And it really highlights the pragmatism of the early Muslims. They weren't averse to adopting useful practices from other cultures, even those they were in conflict with.
Right?
And, the Roman Empire at that time was known for its military prowess and this distinctive style of clothing. So it makes sense that the Prophet Muhammad, as a leader, would be open to incorporating these elements.
Yeah, it speaks to their adaptability, this willingness to learn from others.
Exactly. And that open-mindedness is further reflected in the Hadith that permits Muslims to wear garments made by non-Muslims as long as they're clean and permissible. It suggests that the focus was on practicality over rigid adherence to cultural norms.
So we're seeing this recurring theme of balance and reason, even in matters of clothing.
Yes. And the sensibility, it extends to other aspects of daily life as well. Hadith 18:12, for example, it advises Muslims to close their doors, tie their water skins, cover their vessels at night.
Wait, what does that have to do with military expeditions? It sounds like we made a detour into household tips.
It might seem unrelated, but I think it reflects this broader ethos of preparedness and caution, which was essential for survival, in the Arabian Peninsula.
Yeah, true.
Imagine living in a desert environment where fire could easily spread and water is such a precious resource. This same mindset of vigilance, I think, would have been crucial in military campaigns.
I see. So even these seemingly mundane details offer insights into the mentality, the values that would have shaped the early Muslim community, and that would have also been important on the battlefield.
Precisely. They highlight that importance of planning, of foresight, of taking precautions, whether you're managing your household or leading an army.
It's like piecing together a mosaic. Each individual tile, no matter how small or insignificant, contributes to this larger picture.
And that's what makes studying history so fascinating, this
Yeah.
constant process of discovery.
Absolutely. It's a journey of exploration.
It is.
And Sunan al Tirmidhi really provides this unique and fascinating window into the world of the early Muslims.
It does. And I think we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive.
We have.
We've explored the concept of jihad, we talked about ethical considerations, strategic thinking, and even those personal, those humanizing details about the Prophet Muhammad.
This has been incredible so far.
Welcome back to our deep dive into military expeditions in Sunan al Tirmidhi.
I'm ready to dive back in. It's fascinating how a text from the 9th century can be so relevant to how we think about conflict even today.
It really is. And I think the principles we've been discussing, just conduct, strategic thinking, even those personal details about the Prophet, they all point to this really holistic view of warfare that's often missing, I think, in our modern discussions.
Absolutely. And speaking of modern discussions, we often hear about this idea of speaking truth to power. Is that something that was reflected in these early Islamic teachings?
It absolutely is. Remember how we were talking about that balance between obedience to authority and adherence to Islamic principles?
Right.
That tension actually plays out in some really interesting ways in Sunan al Tirmidhi.
Okay.
So, you mentioned earlier that idea that you're not obligated to follow orders that contradict your faith.
Right, like that early form of civil disobedience.
Exactly. And it goes beyond just refusing unjust orders.
Okay.
Sunan al Tirmidhi also emphasizes this importance of giving honest feedback and counsel, even to those in positions of authority.
Okay.
So there's actually this hadith where a man, he criticizes a military leader for retreating from battle, and you might expect that kind of criticism to be met with punishment.
Right.
But instead, the prophet actually acknowledges the man's right to express his concerns.
Wow, that's pretty radical for any time period, let alone the 7th century.
Yeah.
It really suggests a level of open communication that I wouldn't expect.
Right. It speaks to the value of honesty and accountability. Leaders, they weren't above criticism, and individuals had this duty to speak out against what they saw as wrong, even if it meant challenging those in power.
That's really making me rethink everything I thought I knew about this topic. It's so much more complex than we often hear.
It is, and that complexity is highlighted even further by the way that Sunan al Tirmidhi addresses treachery and betrayal. It goes beyond just condemning those acts. It actually outlines specific penalties for those who engage in them, even if they're fighting on the Muslim side.
So there's no ends justify the means kind of mentality.
Exactly. It really reinforces this idea that there are lines you just don't cross, even in war. And the emphasis is always on maintaining that moral integrity.
So we've talked about Obedience, treachery, speaking truth to power. What other ethical considerations come up?
Well, one of the most prominent themes is the idea of restraint and proportionality in warfare. So remember when we were talking about how it was permissible to destroy enemy fortifications?
Yeah.
Or even to burn trees?
Right, and I remember thinking that sounded pretty extreme.
It does sound extreme. But even in those situations, Sunan al Tirmidhi emphasizes that you have to minimize collateral damage, avoid unnecessary destruction. So it's not about scorched earth tactics. It's about specifically targeting military objectives, while sparing as many civilian lives and property as possible.
That's a pretty progressive concept for any time period,
Right.
let alone 1400 years ago. It shows a real concern for the impact of war on non-combatants.
It does. And it suggests this recognition of the sanctity of human life, even in war, the need to protect the innocent.
So it's not just about winning at all costs. It's about winning in a way that minimizes suffering.
Exactly. And those limits, they extend to the treatment of animals in warfare as well.
Oh, okay.
There's a hadith that explicitly prohibits taking living creatures as target practice.
Wow, I wouldn't have even thought about that.
Eh,
But it makes sense. It's really interesting. Even in war, there's this recognition of the value of all life.
exactly. And avoiding this unnecessary cruelty. So it speaks to this ethic of respecting all living beings, avoiding wanton destruction, and even in this chaos of war, maintaining that humanity and respect.
This is really, I don't know, shifting my understanding of war in the early Muslim community. It's like it offers this blueprint for a more humane and ethical approach.
And while that blueprint might not always have been fully realized, in the complexities of real-world conflict, it still provides that model, that aspirational model, I think.
Right. That's something to strive for.
Exactly.
So it's this reminder that even amidst all that darkness, there's always this possibility for light,
Yes.
for ethical conduct, for a vision of a better way.
It's a message that I think resonates just as strongly today.
It does. So what does this all mean for us? What are the big takeaways for our listeners who are trying to make sense of conflict in the world today?
Well, I think one of the most important takeaways is that Islam's approach to war is just far more nuanced and complex than these kind of simplistic narratives that we hear. It's not just about conquest and violence. It's about justice, ethical conduct, protecting innocent lives.
And recognizing that even in a military context, individuals have a responsibility to speak out.
Exactly. So it's this holistic approach. It takes into account the spiritual, ethical, and practical dimensions of war.
Right.
And it recognizes that true victory lies not just in that military dominance, but in upholding your principles and acting with compassion.
It's a powerful reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can strive for something better.
And that's a message that I think continues to offer hope and guidance, even in the face of these really complex challenges that we face today. And we've covered so much ground so far, from that concept of jihad to all these complexities and even those fascinating glimpses into the Prophet Muhammad's personality.
And we've only scratched the surface.
We have. There's still so much to explore, especially the spiritual dimension of warfare in Islam and the lasting impact of these teachings. So for those of you who are eager to continue this journey with us, join us for part 3 of our deep dive into Sunan al Tirmidhi's teachings on military expeditions. We're going to go even deeper into that intersection of faith and conflict and really discover how these ancient principles, how they continue to resonate today.
Welcome back to our deep dive into military expeditions in Sunan al Tirmidhi.
It's been quite a journey so far.
It has, hasn't it? We've gone from, those strategic insights and then the ethical considerations and those little details that really humanize the Prophet Muhammad.
Right.
But there's one dimension I think we haven't really explored yet.
You're talking about the spiritual side of warfare in Islam.
Yeah, it's something I've always been kind of curious about because on the surface, war and spirituality, they seem like these opposites.
It's a tension that exists in a lot of faiths,
Right.
not just Islam. How do you reconcile the violence and destruction with this pursuit of spiritual growth and peace?
Yeah, it feels almost like a paradox.
Well, in Islam, they're not necessarily seen as mutually exclusive.
Yeah.
That concept of jihad that we keep coming back to,
Right.
it has both that inward and outward dimension.
Yeah.
So it's about striving for righteousness within yourself, but also in the world around you. And sometimes that outward struggle, it can manifest as military action.
So even in warfare, there's this spiritual element.
Exactly. And Sunan al Tirmidhi emphasizes that true victory doesn't just lie in conquering territory or defeating the enemy.
Right.
It also lies in conquering your own ego, your own base desires.
Hmm.
It's about fighting with the right intentions and a pure heart.
So it's not about bloodlust or revenge, but
Exactly.
something higher.
Right. Hadith 1627, I think, captures this beautifully. It states that a man who weeps out of fear of Allah will not enter hellfire.
Wow. That's powerful imagery.
Yeah. It suggests that true strength, it doesn't come from physical prowess, but from humility and submission to a higher power.
So even in the midst of battle, the spiritual struggle continues.
It does, and this inner purification is actually seen as essential for achieving that true victory.
Right.
There's another hadith that says that the dust raised in the cause of Allah and the smoke of hellfire will never meet.
That's an intense visual.
Right. It's almost like this divine protection, this idea that those who are striving in the path of God are shielded from those consequences.
Wow.
And that idea of divine reward is further emphasized in the hadith that says that a gray hair grown in the cause of Allah will be a light on the day of judgment.
So even the hardships endured in warfare are seen as this, this form of spiritual purification.
Exactly. It's a reminder that the struggles of this life, they can have a spiritual significance. They can be seen as tests, even as opportunities for growth.
So this spiritual dimension, it's like it really elevates warfare beyond this physical combat.
It does.
It becomes almost a form of worship.
It does. It becomes a striving in the path of God.
That's a very different way of looking at it.
It is. It's a challenging concept. But it challenges us to consider those deeper motivations behind warfare, both in the past and in the present. Is it about power, greed, revenge? Or is it about this genuine desire to uphold justice?
Yeah, that's a question I think we all need to be asking.
Absolutely. And this spiritual framework that we see in Sunan al Tirmidhi, even though it's rooted in a specific time and context, it provides this really timeless guidance on how to approach conflict with integrity.
So it's not just about winning or losing on the battlefield.
Right.
It's about the state of our hearts, our commitment to these higher principles.
Yes, and that spiritual grounding is so crucial because it prevents that descent into barbarity, that cruelty that often comes with war.
Because we're all accountable to a higher power.
Yes.
That's powerful.
So, by understanding that spiritual dimension of warfare in Islam, we gain this much deeper appreciation for the ethical considerations that we've been discussing.
Yeah, it's not just about rules and regulations. It's about cultivating a certain mindset,
Right.
a way of being.
Exactly. And that's a message that transcends time and culture.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Now, we focused a lot on the ethical and spiritual aspects.
We have.
But I'm also wondering how these teachings actually translate into, legal rulings and practices.
Right.
Because Sunan al Tirmidhi is not just a book of moral philosophy. This is the foundation for Islamic law.
You're absolutely right. And those principles, they've had this really profound impact on Islamic legal thought. For example, that hadith we talked about, the one that prohibits the killing of women and children.
Right.
That forms the basis for legal rulings that protect non-combatants.
Okay.
So it's not just a nice idea. It's a core principle.
So the ethical and legal, they're totally intertwined.
Exactly. It's not just about these abstract concepts. It's about putting them into practice, establishing this framework.
Yeah, and that framework has continued to shape Islamic jurisprudence for centuries.
It has. For example, those hadiths that outline the distribution of spoils. That led to really detailed legal frameworks for managing war booty, ensuring fairness, preventing exploitation.
That's amazing.
These teachings had a real impact.
It's incredible how relevant these ancient texts continue to be.
It is.
They're shaping legal rulings and ethical discussions to this day.
I agree. It shows that enduring power of those principles and their ability to speak to the deepest questions of human existence.
This deep dive has been incredible. We've gone back in time to the battlefields of 7th century Arabia. We've explored the complexities of Islamic law.
Yeah.
We've even gotten to see the Prophet Muhammad's personality a little bit. We've covered a lot of ground.
We have. And through it all, I think we've seen that Islam's approach to warfare is just so much more complex than those simplistic narratives.
Absolutely.
It's an approach that really emphasizes justice and ethical conduct, protecting innocent lives.
And all within a framework of spiritual striving and submission to a higher power.
Exactly. It encourages us to rethink our own assumptions about war, about the possibility of ethical conduct, even in the midst of conflict.
Yeah. So as we conclude this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a question.
Okay.
Given these rules and ethical guidelines that we see in Sunan al Tirmidhi, How do these teachings compare to contemporary approaches to warfare? What lessons can we learn?
It's a vital question, I think.
It is.
And as you consider that question, remember that the pursuit of knowledge and understanding is a journey that never ends.
That's beautiful. Well, thank you for joining us today on this deep dive
It was a pleasure.
into the world of military expeditions in Sunan al Tirmidhi. We hope that it sparked your curiosity
And inspired you.
to keep exploring